Great Plains Veterinary Educational Center as well. My position here is a veterinary epidemiologist. I've been here a relatively short time, not quite a year yet. And before this, I came from Missouri. So, Dr. Williams, your comments about starting cattle without a lot of the resources that producers here in Nebraska have is something I just not too long ago left that arena. So it might be good to have a conversation sometime. I got a PhD at Iowa State along with my vet degree, and my PhD had a lot of things in it. And one of those subjects that I spent quite a bit of time on was immunology. So vaccination and immune responses in cattle are pretty entertaining to me. And there's been some work that's come out of late, I would say in the last 4 to 5 years, that counteract some of our paradigms about how we use vaccination in feedlot cattle. So that's I'm going to present a little bit of data from a few publications today that get at that subject a little bit. So the vaccination in feeder cattle or cattle on arrival at feedlots is, I would consider it almost a standard practice. Most of the feedlots that I've interacted with vaccinate either as the cattle show up, or they might implement a strategy like an hour of rest for every hour on the truck, and then they bring them in and process. And that processing almost always includes some form of vaccination. The question is this a safe practice? Are there cattle that maybe are safe to vaccinate and maybe others are not safe to vaccinate? And when should we vaccinate those cattle? Those are the questions that we're going to address today. I think the assumption that most feedlot producers and veterinarians working with feedlot cattle have made historically, and many continue to make, is that vaccination is at worst, it's equivocal. It's the loss of the dollars used to purchase the vaccine and put it in the animals. And I hope after today you have some questions in your mind about whether that is a safe assumption to make or not. So just a little bit of background about vaccination. It's interesting, if you read labels in detail, there's a lot of guidance and a lot of information presented on a vaccine label. And most of us, even veterinarians, I'm guilty of this frequently, we don't take the time to read the entire label because it's a lot of really tiny print. But one of the most bolded pieces of information on a vaccine label, or this is a direct quote from a vaccine label, is general directions: vaccination of healthy cattle is recommended. And almost every vaccine that we can put into cattle or animals in general carries a statement that's like that one or very similar to it, that says we should vaccinate healthy animals. In other parts of the medicine field, human medicine, small animal veterinary medicine, we actually go to pretty great lengths to make sure that our patients are healthy before we vaccinate them. You know, when I go to the doctor to get a vaccine, I get a physical exam. You know, they at least check my temperature and make sure I'm feeling good before they'll give me that vaccine. We don't do that for cattle typically, because we do it in mass. And the question is, are these newly received calves really healthy? We know that there's stress associated with transport and many times weaning. We have commingling, which introduces both social stress and a lot of exposure to new pathogens. We've got transport that introduces some physiologic stress and also exposes them to exhaust fumes and things like that. So these cattle fit the definition of healthy animals. This is one of my favorite slides to demonstrate the impact of stress and kind of gets to the idea of, can we call a stressed animal healthy? This is a study that was done down in Oklahoma State. They brought in a group of several groups of calves actually, but the gist of the study was that the market group, which you'll see, can you guys see my pointer on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So the market group right here, this group of calves was highly commingled calves that were purchased from Mississippi at sale barns, and they were brought to a backgrounding operation in Oklahoma. And then they took calves from one ranch and they subjected them to 3 treatments. So you've got, all these calves came from the same ranch. One group, they weaned them, put them on a truck, and sent them to the same backgrounding operation on the day of weaning. So they left the cow, got on the truck, went to the backgrounder that same day. Another group, they weaned them for 45 days, then sent them to the backgrounding operation. And the final group, they did a 45-day weaning, and they also vaccinated them. I'm just going to focus on overall morbidity, and you can look at this anyway. All these results, as you can see over here, are highly significant. We usually consider a threshold of 0.05 in this P category to be a significant result. If these animals, the highest risk animals in this group would be the market animals. They're commingled. They have unknown management history. We don't know anything about them. And in this case, the morbidity was not significantly different. If you see these little letters up here, groups with the same letters are not significantly different from each other. Weaned calves that got on the truck the day of weaning had as equivalent level of morbidity treatment compared to calves that were commingled and purchased at an auction market and shipped from Mississippi to Oklahoma. Weaning and vaccination combined with weaning were actually the same. So from this data, you can see that stress plays a huge role. Putting stressed cattle on a truck, sending them to a feedlot, even if they're not commingled, resulted in almost as much respiratory disease as buying completely unknown history calves from a sale barn. So the reason I put this in here is even calves that came from a ranch, they're weaned, hopefully they're vaccinated, but we need to consider whether or not they are good candidates, whether they're healthy candidates for vaccination. So there's been well, first of all, the thing to think about with vaccination is, what are our expectations? What do we want our vaccines to do? I think of vaccination as a preparation for something else. We're preparing that animal immunologically to deal with an infection. There's a little bit of information about using vaccines as a treatment. That's a little bit, it's used in some cases. There's a little bit of data. It's kind of a gray area. But in general, we really want to use this as a tool to prepare cattle for an infection that we think they're going to encounter. The problem is that on arrival, cattle have already been exposed to a lot of things, especially if they've come through a sale barn or been commingled in any way. So vaccinating is kind of putting the cart in front of the horse, because the exposure that we're trying to protect them from has happened before we vaccinate, when we do vaccination on arrival. So with that in mind, there's been a couple studies that have looked directly at this question. The first one I'm going to present is a study that was done at University of Arkansas. Dr. Richardson did this study, and essentially what they did is they took 528 steers and bulls. These were highly commingled, auction market derived calves. These are quintessential high risk calves. They castrated the bulls at the time of arrival, so that adds a level of risk. But they randomized these calves into 2 treatments. They put them in an arrival vaccination group, which essentially they waited 24 hours after the cattle were delivered to their facility and vaccinated them, and then the delayed vaccination group, where they were vaccinated 14 days after they arrived at the facility. They did not use metaphylaxis, which would be kind of abnormal for calves like this. So bear that in mind looking at the results. They looked at performance in respiratory disease. The first slide I'll show you here is essentially the performance outcomes from this study. Up here in the top of the table, these are arrival vaccination calves. So they got that modified live vaccine on arrival. These are the calves that were delayed or 14 days after arrival. Here again is that p-value. And what I've done is highlighted a couple of significant differences. On arrival, their weights were essentially equal. There was a difference of about 4 pounds by day 14, and that was significant. And if you look here at the gain differences, there was significant differences in gain, and it pretty much happened from day 0 to 14. So the time that this group had gotten a vaccine, but this group hadn't, generated a significantly higher average daily gain in the delayed group. And pretty much everything evened out. There was little differences back and forth between the groups, but by the time they finished this backgrounding phase, which was 42 days long, that gain difference had persisted, and the calves that were vaccinated 14 days later were gaining almost 1/4 pound more a day over that entire period. I'm a little hesitant about gain data like this. I would like to see a longer period represented in any kind of a gain comparison, but it's interesting. Also bear in mind these are kilograms, not pounds, so you got to multiply that number. When you look at the respiratory disease incidence, I think the most notable thing is that there were no differences. In 42 days, they had no differences in initial respiratory disease treatment, retreatments. There was no differences in days to first treatment or death loss between those two groups. Treatment costs were the same, and this graph over on the right here is actually their morbidity curve. So if you go up from day 14 and look at where those two curves ended up, essentially all of their respiratory disease, except for a few cases, actually happened in that first 14 days. So the vaccine didn't change overall morbidity based on when it was given, but the calves that had a delayed response, while these are not different, didn't go any higher or experience any more loss over the course of the study compared to the calves that were vaccinated immediately when they showed up. So the conclusions from that are essentially that it didn't really affect respiratory disease occurrence at all. And there's a little difference in performance that's maybe slightly questionable, but it's an interesting finding. They also did a bunch of titer work for this project, and they looked at BHV1 or IBR titers, and on day 0 they showed that they were exactly the same. By day 14, the calves that had gotten the vaccine on arrival were still no different than calves who hadn't been vaccinated at all. These bars are a little bit different, but the p-value indicates that they're still not statistically different from each other. By day 28, the way I interpret this is there's significant differences that are occurring between these two groups. And it looks, based on the data they're showing here, that the calves that were vaccinated at day 14 were substantially more prepared to respond to that vaccine when it was given than the animals that were vaccinated on arrival. These calves that were vaccinated on arrival never get above 25% seroconversion. So those are the animals that actually responded and showed antibodies to the vaccine. So the take home here is that calves that are highly stressed, highly commingled, they might not, even though we're putting the vaccine on board, we might be hurting them a little bit. They are certainly not responding to that vaccine the way we'd like them to. So that's a study that might not be particularly applicable to Nebraska feedlots because they're pretty high risk cattle. Those are kind of the southeastern model. There was another study that was published earlier this year, and this looked at the effects of delayed respiratory viral vaccine and the inclusion of an immunostimulant on feedlot health, performance, and carcass merits of feed auction market heifers. So these are Texas and Oklahoma derived cattle. They're coming from an auction market. The impression that I get is that they were coming in bigger drafts. These were not bought 1 and 2 at a time. They were bigger groups of cattle, but it's a substantially larger study. There's 5,000, just over 5,000 head of calves in this study in 60 pens. So the last study was a small pen study. Those calves are housed about 10 head to a pen. This is just under 100 pen per pen. And they were subjected to 4 treatments. They were basically the ones that we're interested in is whether or not they were vaccinated on arrival or vaccinated 14 days, or excuse me, this will be 30 days after arrival. And then they included this immunostimulant treatment, which shows up in the results, but we're going to focus on the timing of vaccination. These animals were given metaphylaxis on arrival, and rather than following for just 42 days, they actually followed these cattle all the way to finish. So they presented a lot of interval data. So they've got at 60 days or 60, I think, and then again at 115 or 20 days. But I'm just going to show you the closeout data from these animals. There's a couple of significant findings. The first two columns represent the vaccine status. So this is delayed vaccination. This is arrival vaccination. These are the immunostimulant columns, and here are the p-values that are associated with the vaccine. And there's two significant findings, and they're tied to each other. One of them is there's about a 1.5% decrease in the number of retreatments associated with respiratory disease. The other significant finding is directly tied to that. So this is the retreatment risk. There was roughly a 4.5–5% decrease in the risk of retreatment for respiratory disease. So those are two numbers that are essentially getting at the same thing. Both are significant findings. There's several things that are approaching trends, but in general, the take home here is that animals that were vaccinated on arrival tended to require more second treatments for respiratory disease. Their first treatment risk was not any different. So the number of animals that were treated for the first time were statistically the same. So this is another way to look at that retreatment risk. There's about a 4.5–5% increase in the risk of getting retreated if they were vaccinated on arrival compared to getting vaccinated 30 days later. This is the performance data. There was one tendency toward having a little bit lower hot carcass weight in the delayed vaccination group, but all the other, also final body weight, which would be tied pretty closely together. All the other things are pretty much the same. So there's two ways to look at this. There's not a lot of difference between the groups, and maybe there's some increased treatment costs associated with vaccinating on arrival that would be associated with having to treat more calves a second time for respiratory disease. The other way to look at it is that there also wasn't a lot of harm all the way to closeout by delaying vaccination for a month. So it presents an interesting set of questions that we need to consider. I wonder, does every calf need a respiratory viral vaccine at arrival? And if so, which of them do? I kind of separate calves into three categories. The data that I showed you is probably the high risk group of calves. Maybe vaccination for them is unnecessary or even deleterious to their outcomes. And then there's really low risk calves. So these are your large group ranch calves that have probably been well vaccinated before they show up at a feedlot. Do they ever need to be vaccinated when they get to the feedlot? And then there's probably a group in between that might benefit more than either one of those two groups from some kind of vaccine in a feedlot situation. And then I think there are more important considerations that we need to look at. Stress and risk categorization essentially go together, but they might be things that we should probably look at more than or take into consideration more when we think about vaccination. With that, I'll take any questions or entertain any comments.
Any questions from the group for Brian? I do have one if there aren't any, or to get it started. So what about killed? And I hear feedback from producers on modified live and causing the immune response and reaction, so to speak, by the cattle. Is there any differences across those? And I know killed vaccines are sort of unheard of. Is this applied equally to all vaccines?
So everything that I've talked about here is modified live vaccine, and that I would, Dale, you can comment on this too, but I would, in my experience, that's been pretty much the standard in feedlots. There's not very many that are using killed products. And the reason for that is the protection that you get from modified live, if it works, is a lot broader. I don't need to be certain that the the vaccine matches the challenge perfectly, which is almost impossible to do anyway. So my protection is broader using a modified live. It actually happens quicker. Killed virus vaccines, the onset of immunity is probably minimally 14 days anyway. And some of these modified live vaccines, they've been able to detect immune response as early as 5 days in some of those vaccines. So there's just not a lot of work that's been done with killed virus vaccines in feedlot situations. You go into the cow-calf world, that changes significantly. There's actually some notable differences that are worth talking about. But for the purposes of a feedlot meeting, we're gonna stick with modified lives because I think that's pretty much standard in the industry.
Brian, this is well, I'll back off. Is there somebody else that started? I cut somebody off.
This is Jill. I was just going to ask, like, for the lay person, for an article, right, regarding this, you're basically, the theme to this is when we're vaccinating them on arrival, they are probably too stressed really for that vaccine to do a lot of good. And by delaying it, then the vaccine has more efficacy down the road.
Yeah, I would say that's a direct takeaway. The other thing that I would kind of like to stimulate some thought on is we always view vaccines as something that they're really safe. We never think of them as being bad. They never hurt anything. And I think that's a misclassification of vaccines. They have the potential to cause problems. And I think feedlot owners know this. People that vaccinate cattle and then watch them understand that vaccines are not harmless. And the problem is that we've never quantified that until these, some of these studies that I've shown you today. And there's actually other reports that I've seen the research results and they haven't been published, but they actually, as you increase the risk of the cattle, meaning they're more stressed or they're large bulls that are castrated on arrival or something like that, you can actually really harm those animals by vaccinating them on arrival. So I'm kind of waiting for them to publish some of that stuff so I can talk more about it. But I think that's the other thing that we have a growing body of data that suggests that maybe not only will the vaccines not work, they might actually hurt the cattle. They might do something we don't want.
Brian, I'll maybe put you on the spot, but ask for your comments. You've presented data here on a couple of studies, and one fairly large one. But how confident are you in how true these data might run for millions of cattle that are going into feed yards, given large variability in immune status and risk of risk factors present in cattle going into feed yards, maybe this fall? How applicable is this, and how much confidence do you have?
There's a couple ways to look at that. One thing that I struggle with a lot is the way that we assign risk categories to cattle. It's very subjective, and most of the time the risk factors are unknown. Like the big things, especially on auction market cattle, the majority of those coming into feedlots don't have a lot of information attached to them. So we don't know about their weaning status other than what we can tell by watching the behavior of the calves. We don't know much about their vaccine status. We don't know what kind of nutritional plane they were on before they showed up at the sale barn. There's a lot of stuff that limits our ability to classify risk. One of the things that does make me a little more comfortable with applying these results to other cattle is that this, I think, represents two populations of cattle. One of them is pretty close to the worst case scenario. That University of Arkansas study, it's hard to imagine a group of cattle that's going to have higher risk than that. 560 some animals that were purchased, commingled, high percentage of bulls in that group. Those are those are really high risk animals. And they were able to detect some differences. So and then the other study are still not, they considered them high risk, but I don't think they represent nearly the risk that the first group did. So if a producer was trying to decide what's the risk of waiting to vaccinate, I think you can use this data to say if it doesn't affect the outcomes for really high risk cattle, it probably, and I say probably with everything that means, right? We haven't done enough of this to be able to confidently say it will not affect outcomes. But it looks to me, playing a kind of a conservative role, that it probably won't affect outcomes for lower risk cattle.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions for Brian? Okay, if not, that concludes the webinar for today. Again, mostly for those that watch the recording, we'll have another webinar on Wednesday, November 1st, and the topic of that webinar will be on valuing manure. And apologize if you did have trouble getting access. We will work on that and fix that. So hopefully if you can and you're free, Wednesday, November 1st at 12:30, we'll log on again and do another topic. Thanks for joining us.